Hey, welcome to the Millennial Money Canada podcast. I'm your host, Guillaume. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. If you're a new listener, welcome. Our goal with this podcast is to help you elevate your knowledge about finance so that you can live well, build wealth, give generously, and leave a legacy that you're proud of at the end. This episode specifically is for incorporated business owners, highly paid or high income earners, executives, and also professional athletes who want to increase their retirement savings by using a tool that is called the retirement compensation arrangement. It's sort of a Swiss Army knife of retirement planning for highly paid individuals. And to discuss what is a retirement compensation arrangement, as also known as an RCA, we have a repeated guest, Tatenda Mawoyo, who was there on episode 17, where we chatted about the IPP, Individual Pension Plan. He works at GBL, which is a leading expert on advanced retirement planning solutions. And that's why we brought him back on the podcast today to discuss the advantages, disadvantages, and everything you need to know around retirement compensation arrangements, or RCA. Let's go to the episode. I hope you enjoy. Tatenda, welcome back to the Millennial Money Canada podcast.
Guillaume, Sam, thank you. Appreciate it. I'm happy to be here.
You are our first repeated guest, so it's quite an honor to have you twice. So
there you go. Let's take that as a good thing, I guess, right?
Yeah, welcome back. Thank you so much for your time in advance. For the listeners, Tatenda was on episode 17, where we covered the individual pension plan. So if it's an episode that you haven't listened to, you can always go back to that episode and listen to it if you're interested in learning more about what is an IPP and how can that benefit you, and how does that differ from using an RSP or other planning solutions for business owners out there. But today, we have Tatenda back on the podcast to talk about an RCA, a retirement compensation arrangement. So Tatenda, today we're going to ask you a number of questions to better understand like what they are, what are the characteristics, who are they suited for, and then we're going to dive in, other topics as the use cases, and as well as the advantages and the disadvantages, and also like, who is not suited for that type of solutions. If it's okay with you.
Awesome. Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right. First question. So what is a retirement compensation arrangement? What are the different components of an RCA?
Okay, sure. And I have to answer that. So a retirement compensation arrangement, from here on, I might just use the acronym RCA, just so that the podcast isn't twice as long. I'm trying to say that every time. So what it is, it's a special retirement savings plan that an employer and an employee can enter into together. The idea of it is that it's something that's supplemental to all of the other types of sort of vehicles we see out there, right? Such as RSPs, IPPs, and what have you. And really the intention of them is to help supplement the retirement savings, especially high income people can have. So typically an RCA is going to provide much more contribution than you get in an RSP, much more than you get in an IPP even, with the idea being the employer is going to be able to put money into that, tax deductible to them. As an employee who's a participant in this RCA, there's no immediate taxable benefit. So it's money going in completely tax deferred, typically large sums of money that we're able to do with that. And then sort of you get that tax deferral all the way until the retirement years. So it's sort of that age old, not trick, but I guess strategy of putting money into a vehicle that's tax deferred and trying to defer that income further down the road. Now, what this is, it's something that's recognized by the CRA, which is why it comes with such some of these strong sort of tax benefits and tax advantages. So it's not gimmicky; it's something defined right in the Act. But what is interesting about it is sort of the components of it in terms of how it works. So when money is put into an RCA, for example, we can think of maybe a business owner who runs their business through their corporation. So they have this corporation or this business that they have set up an RCA. And suppose in a particular year, this corporation wants to put in $100,000 into the RCA. An RCA essentially has two components to it, or two parts. One would be an investment account. So I can just call it the RCA investment account. So what happens is half of that contribution, half of that 100,000, so 50,000, would go into this investment account to be managed, invested, and grow. The other half would actually be sent to the CRA, and it's held in a special type of account called a refundable tax account. Now, with this money, this 50% that gets sent to the CRA, that's not invested. It's essentially a cash balance. It's a non-interest bearing account, and it's held in escrow for the uh, for the participant or the individual until when they retire down the road. So obviously that's where the questions started to come up, right? Is why would I set up an RCA if I'm going to send half my money to the government and it's not going to be earning any interest? But I'm sure we'll get more into that because, like I mentioned, it is a refundable tax, so it does eventually come back. And once you start really getting into the details, you can start to see that there can be a lot of advantages to it, especially when it comes to trying to maximize how much money am I going to have after tax at the end of the day.
So I've noticed that, like with IPPs, for example, there's a pretty distinct qualification. Like if you have maxed out your RSPs, if you've been taking salary, if you're over age 40 and you're making around $150,000 to $200,000 a year, you might be the ideal candidate for an IPP. With an RCA, it seems maybe a little bit more vague as to who would be an ideal candidate for an RCA. Do you mind going into who you see mostly taking up this type of program, this type of plan, what income levels they'd be at, what type of structure are they, like highly compensated executive employees? Are they business owners? Like, what does that look like typically?
Yeah. So great question, great point. It's especially when it comes to RCAs, I've heard them described as sort of a Swiss Army knife of retirement planning, because there are so many use cases. And at a place like GBL, we've been around since 1995. I'd say every 2-3 years, there's sort of another use case for it that comes up, because it's so flexible. But if I were looking at it, and trying to identify, I guess, who we see taking advantage of RCAs, a few categories, maybe 3 or 4. One would be what you kind of hinted at, which is sort of your highly compensated key executives, in a different sort of scenarios. One that's probably easiest to understand and really shows what the value of an RCA can come in is for severance packages. So oftentimes you might have an executive who's been let go by a corporation, just sort of bittersweet, but oftentimes you have a corporation that is willing to help the executive maybe manage the tax bill on their severance. So, for example, I'll kind of use like a case I'm working on as just as an example. Is just a couple weeks ago, I had an executive and their severance package is about $500,000. So option one is the corporation can just pay this executive just that $500,000 as a lump sum. Here in Alberta, they were at the top tax rate already, so about 48%, right? So you have 48%. I'll just make it easy. Essentially, half of the money is gone to taxes anyways. What the employer agreed to do was to say, you know what, rather than pay this to you directly, we're going to set up an RCA for you. And then we're going to fund it with the severance as a retirement allowance, which is obviously above board, can be done all the time. And so what that does is the corporation can fund the RCA. They obviously still get to deduct the money. For the executive, there's no tax owing on it right away. So what this executive now gets to do is, rather than receive the amount as a lump sum in 1 year, or tax at the top rate, they get to spread that income over multiple years, where they're going to be in a lower tax bracket. In this case, I was looking at about maybe a 6-year period. So overall, the 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 tax owing on that severance amount, it's going to be in a lower bracket. So the math worked out to be the after-tax income was going to go up by about $60,000-$70,000, just by virtue of the fact of, rather than pay money at a top tax rate immediately, you're able to spread it over a number of years, which is sort of what the value of the RCA comes in. So we see it a lot for sort of these severance cases. For executives as well, typically you're looking at high income people, right, where their T4 is north of what they need to maximize an RSP. I believe in 2025, somebody needs about $187,000 of salary to max out the RSP. But you might have executives who are, being T4 $400,000, $500,000. And there's no retirement program in there that can be funded to sort of support, let's say, an 18% of your full T4 salary, right? You can max out your RSP, you can max out your defined contribution plan. So oftentimes you might see an RCA being used to supplement something like a group RSP or a DC plan, even like a defined benefit pension plan, to say, we're going to max that out, but your income is so high and we want to be able to provide your retirement benefit to reflect your high income. So we're going to use an RCA on top of that to give us something else that we can fund that's still tax efficient for you. So those are a couple of examples we see being taken for executives. I could talk maybe a little bit about athletes as well, professional athletes. Now they sort of get a special exemption or special rule where they can actually defer some of their salary, where rather than receive it immediately, a team, like an NHL or MLB team, can set up an RCA for them. And it's all the same mechanics, right? Somebody has a contract, maybe you do $5 million a year. They might, agree to only receive $4 million, and the other $1 million is funded into the RCA. So again, sort of you're avoiding that immediate tax, and you're saying you're setting that aside for your retirement, in which case you might draw down in a lower tax bracket, or maybe you move to a jurisdiction with more favorable tax rules. So it's just helping with the overall tax situation.
I've noticed that, like, with players, let's say professional athletes, a lot of them, let's look at the NBA or MLB, for example. A lot of them call the USA home, but they play on, maybe some Canadian sports teams. Is there a tax benefit to contributing in Canada and then moving back down into the States in their US jurisdiction and drawing it down? Does it get taxed in their home jurisdiction when they're drawing it out? So, for example, because I know there's a tax treaty between the USA and Canada that allows RCAs and recognizes RCAs. So do they then realize that tax delta on their withdrawals in their home jurisdiction, or is it still taxed in Canada?
Yeah, so a little bit of both, but people will sort of do RCAs because overall it's going to help minimize overall tax. Now, one thing I will say is, to your point, this works well for athletes. We also do see this working well for business owners as well. If somebody is looking to retire and maybe relocate to, like you mentioned, to the States. So same sort of mechanics, where once the money's in the RCA and it's coming out, on any withdrawals, because of the tax treaty, you're looking at a tax rate that's between, baseline is 25% of the withholding tax on the Canada side. Depending on how the payouts are structured, if they're structured more as a longer term payment, the term will be a periodic payment, then that withholding tax rate can go down from 25 to 15%, which would obviously be favorable. And then on the rest, they'll be taxed in the jurisdiction where they are. Which if somebody's in a jurisdiction with just low income tax or no state tax, that could work out very well for them. Because now you're only subject to the 0.25% or the 15% withholding in Canada. And then you're sort of left in once you're in the States or in a more favorable jurisdiction.
Yeah, because like someone making $5 million in contract, if they chose to take, let's say that's $5 million a year. I know they're usually not structured that way. Usually it's like signing bonus and minimum salaries and production bonuses. But you're thinking like, okay, if someone's making $5 million in salary a year, like 4.6 million of that is getting taxed at 53.5% in Canada, in Ontario, versus going this route, depending on how much they're able to contribute, they could lower that tax rate down to potentially like 30 to 40% overall on the withdrawal. So obviously you can see the extreme benefit that this has. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And one thing I didn't mention early on, I think it's maybe I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up. We kind of talked about the RCA boogeyman, I suppose, which is that 50% that's sent to the CRA. And we made a point to say that, it's put in a refundable tax account, right? So it's not necessarily a prepayment of tax, but, it's just this money that you get to go, you get back eventually. And then when you do pay tax, you pay tax based on, what your tax bracket is at the time you make the withdrawal. So the question becomes, well, how do I get that tax refunded back to me? So when money is going into the RCA from the employer or the corporation, we kind of talked about that 50-50 split, right? Half goes into an investment account, you get to manage and grow. Half is get sent to the CRA. When it comes time to make the withdrawals in retirement, that's when the refunds get triggered. So for example, if somebody in a particular year says, you know what, Sam's GM, I want to buy a boat this year. I need an extra, I don't know how much a boat costs, but let's say I need an extra $100,000. It's like, great, right? We'll pay you $100,000 from the RCA. And then there's a 50% refund rate. So then the CRA will say, great, you paid yourself $100,000. So now we're going to send you back half of that, $50,000, from this refundable tax account back into your investment account. So now you can get to manage and grow, invest and grow that money as well. So that's how the refunds get tracked back.
I just want to go back to kind of the beginning, like just making sure, everyone on the call, everyone who's listening to this podcast is kind of understanding all the components. So a few examples that you mentioned, whether it's a highly paid executives or like an athlete, they are expecting a certain amount, whether it's a severance or whether it's a, highly paid salary that is, should be entirely taxable, right, in the current year that is received. So in order to avoid that extremely high tax bill, one way would be for the corporation to put that amount into an RCA for that employee. Is that correct? That's the first part. Right? And then after that, so that's $500,000 or $1 million contribution to the RCA for the employee. That's a tax deduction to the corporation itself. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then once it gets to the RCA, then it gets split 50-50. One portion goes to an investment account, and then one portion is held in a CRA tax account or refundable tax account. So that is the name. Okay. And then the portion that is going into an investment account, is this a non-registered account or is it a tax deferred account? What is the...
Yeah, so it's essentially when the RCA is funded for the investment account, it's funded in trust. So essentially, there's a trust that's set up for the RCA, and then that trust would obviously open up the account to sort of hold the investments
and that's tax deferred. That's tax deferred. Okay, perfect. And
well, to tax deferred, in terms of, I guess there's no personal tax. But one thing I should mention is, in interest or dividends, the term is any realized capital gains that occur in the investment account. Half of that also gets sent to the refundable tax account of the CRA. So in terms of that sort of 50-50 split in terms of what's in the account and with CRA, that applies to any contributions, so any new money going in. And it also applies to any realized capital gains. So your interest, dividends, and realized gains, half of that growth is also sent to the refundable tax account.
Got you. Okay, when received. Okay, I have a couple of questions here. One of them is, when you look at that type of structure, like Sam mentioned on the IPP, there's pretty specific criteria that you kind of need to check off before implementing it. When you look at the RCA, like realistically speaking, what is the, minimum amount that someone would want to look into in order for this solution to even be looked at or make sense?
Yeah,
as a starting conversation.
Mm-hmm. So, typically what we see, especially for plans that are going to go ahead, you're typically looking for somebody whose salary is, I'd say, north of $250,000 a year on average. That's when you're going to start to see sort of significant and meaningful contribution room created in the RCA for somebody to take advantage of. Now, when it comes to, I've sort of mentioned a few times, contributions being made to an RCA. A question typically come up in terms of, well, how much can I put into an RCA, right? Can I just pick and choose what I want, or is there a calculation done? Like, who says what's good and what's too much? So CRA will say, it has to be quote unquote reasonable, which is their favorite term. But what that means is essentially there's an actuary that needs to do the calculation to figure out what the cap is. Now the reason I threw out sort of let's say $250,000 salary level is, one of the things actually is going to take a look at is, well, what's your compensation from an employer, right? So we're going to look at your age. We're going to look at what your average T4 salary is from the corporation that's setting this up. We're looking at, how long have you been an employee for? Those things sort of bake into the calculation. And then the actual sort of say, well, this is a reasonable amount that we can certify for you to have in the RCA. But typically, once the T4 is north of that, you're going to have meaningful contribution to utilize.
So one thing that I'm thinking of right now is, okay, if you're an incorporated business owner, you've been paying yourself, let's say the RSP maximum 185, 190,000 a year in salary. What would be the benefit for that business owner to set up an RCA versus to just have the funds held in a holding company? And then I think this goes to a second part of the question, which is like, well, what happens to the RCA at death? Because obviously we know the implications of what happens to a corporation at death. There's a potential for double taxation if it's not structured the right way, those types of things. So like, can you walk through some of those kind of trade-offs or maybe benefits that a business owner might see to set this up?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a valid question. And whenever we have a case come across that, that's something we always sort of mention should be considered. I mean, to sort of what I'm sure Sam, you're thinking right on the spot is, we sort of mentioned how when you put money into an RCA, half your money isn't being invested, it's just sort of sitting there. So you only get to sort of invest 50 cents on the dollar. Whereas if your money is going to be in a corporation, if we assume you're being taxed at a small business deduction rate, depending on where you are, you're probably investing 80 something cents on the dollar, right? Because much less is being held.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of need to wonder, well, what's the trade-off? Why would I do one or the other? So some of the considerations, it's just a few things we see come up. One is, I suppose we are assuming somebody has a holding company. I suppose that's not always the case. So we have had clients where, there's no holding company, that there's no desire to set one up for one reason or the other. But they might be trying to preserve the access to the lifetime capital gains exemption for when they sell down the road. So it becomes an exercise of, well, how do we purify the corporation? How do we make sure we're not building up, too much in the way of passive assets or excess cash in the corp? So an RCA is something else that is considered because it just gives a method for money to be taken out. To Guillaume's great summary, as the corporation gets to claim the deduction on that, and there's no personal tax owing immediately on the money in the RCA. So that'll sort of be one consideration. Other things that will be considered is, what's the need for maybe creditor protection? Now, obviously, I'm not saying holding companies don't have creditor protection, but people much smarter than I am they'll sort of take a look at that and say, well, do we have maybe an extra reason to not have as much, or do we need to have more diversification in terms of not having things within a corporation? And so people might look into an RCA because RCAs do come with very strong creditor protection. So just a way to get money out of a gain out of a corporate structure without paying a bunch of personal tax right away. So those would be sort of some of the two main more motivations. Now, like I said earlier on, an RCA really is it's an amazing Swiss Army knife. And so I'll kind of touch on your question about what happens at death, because that does inform some of the strategies we see around RCAs. Where an RCA is different to something like a pension plan or an RSP is, a client or an individual can name named beneficiaries in the RCA. So and the way it works is, should the individual pass away, and let's say the surviving spouse as well, down the road, there's no need for the assets to be disposed out of the RCA to the named beneficiaries. Is essentially the money can remain tax sheltered, and deferred from personal tax in the RCA, and then the beneficiaries can either make regular withdrawals, for example, from the RCA. So it gives an opportunity to, let's say, help manage some of the estate things or taxes that might be happening at the time of death. So one interesting case we had, for example, was a family business. They had 3 children, and 2 of them were actively involved in the business, but 1 was not. So obviously the question became, well, how do we help to equalize things amongst the 3 children? And in that case, for example, because of the ability to sort of do this intergenerational transfer of the RCA, the child who was not involved in the RCA was named as a beneficiary in the RCA. The one who was not involved in the business. and really for the purpose of that is let's create something where we can tax efficiently, right? As the parents, we don't need this money, but let's create something where we can tax efficiently move this money to this child is not in the business, while understanding that you got these other two who are in the business, and just kind of give us tools that we can work with. So I know that's sort of a lot of information there, but just to kind of say it really is super flexible, and those are some of the reasons we see people kind of considering a debt versus just a holding company structure.
Interesting. I want to go back to the that discussion around, like, maybe what happens when you pass away, or how you want to decumulate it. But before we get there, I just want to go back to the window while you're setting it up and while you're contributing to it. So far, one thing that we've been talking about is, like, let's say that lump sum in that current year. But once you've set up that RCA, is it something that you can make? Let's say that high income executives is expecting to make $500,000 to $700,000 a year, and then every single year he wants to put $200,000 into the RCA. Is it something that happens on a recurring basis, on a yearly basis, or is it more of a once-off setup? Can you talk about that throughout, like, the lifetime of the employee? And then after that, let's talk about the decumulation strategies and what happens then, and
Right.
the
Yeah,
tax impact.
for sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So in terms of money going into the RCA, I'll kind of mention a couple of things of that. It does not have to be a one-off occurrence. It can happen over multiple years. So for example, an employer might set this up for a key employee, and they'll kind of determine what formula they want to use, saying we're going to apply this formula and make regular contributions to the RCA on your behalf. And one of the flexible things with the RCA is you can get a lot of custom vesting rules, right? With pension plans, typically you're looking at 2 years, but an employer might sort of use it as golden handcuffs, right? Saying if you stay on for 5 years, you get all the money you put in. If you leave sooner than that, maybe you don't get access to all of it. So it gives an employer sort of a lot of flexibility to determine how much are they putting in at what rate as well. Now, the one thing I will mention is, especially when it comes to executives, CRA would sort of say you can't use an RCA as a salary deferral arrangement, meaning that the executive sort of just gets to pick and choose on a year-by-year basis in terms of what they can put in. So this will be more sort of set up as part of the compensation structure by between the employer and the employee at the employment agreement level, right? What typically is, right, this is what your salary is going to be bonuses, RSUs, or what have you. At the same time, we're also going to set up this RCA, and we're going to make contributions to it. Now they get to determine how they do that. There might be consideration for performance, for example, or what have you. But typically it's going to be part of the compensation structure or package, if you will, to say this is what your salary is. So it might be an otherwise lower salary than it might have been, realizing the fact that this is RCA that's also in the mix to bump up the overall compensation.
So with different jurisdictions and different corporations, for example, like some of the bigger tech companies that operate out of the US, the US government has different rules for what they consider a salary deferral arrangement than what Canada considers a salary deferral arrangement. Does that ever come into play when you look at, because I think the amount is you can't defer salary over 3 years or something like that, or else it becomes a salary deferral arrangement in Canada. I could be wrong on that, but in the US it's 4. That was kind of what was floating through my head. So are there kind of issues and hoops to jump through when classifying with the CRA, whether this is a real salary deferral arrangement, or it's a part of the compensation structure?
Yeah, good question. So, believe it or not, I was actually reading into the Income Tax Act because the case came up, and I was just trying to better understand what a salary deferral arrangement was, or I guess how they define it. So it's pretty general terms that they don't put a time frame on it. So really the rule is anything that is intended to be a salary or a wage or bonus, but is not, it's especially in the RCA context, if something is supposed to be a salary, a wage, or bonus in a particular year, then it should be paid and taxable in that year. And then any other arrangement beyond that could be considered a salary defer arrangement. So typical fashion where they kind of put a general sort of definition out there, if you will, And then they'd obviously, for specific cases, review it on a case-by-case basis. So there's no specific number that they've given us to be able to use.
Classic CRA, hey?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
When you look at the way you're studying or the way you're evaluating the value of an RCA, I know right now we're in talk with, one of my production clients where I'm gathering the information, I'm turning over to you, and then you will conduct the analysis as far as, what is the potential value derived from an IPP, what is the potential value derived from an RCA. Can you talk about how they can work in tandem? And from your experience, what is the pecking order as far as like what usually people tend to prioritize if you're talking about small business owners, sometimes solopreneurs, or corporate professionals, that sort of clientele, which is also who we work with closely.
Right. Yeah. So in looking at that group specifically, I'd say typically the default consideration, or what I would say we should take a look at first, is the IPP in terms of the stack and order. And really part of the main reason for that is you get to invest all your money, right? So there's no that 50% sitting with the CRA. So it's a more of a question of, you get to set this up in terms of the tax, I guess the tax benefits. Your corporation still gets the tax deduction. You still don't pay any personal tax right away on any contributions. You get to tax different tax shelter money until the retirement years, and you have all your money working for you. So that sort of becomes as opposed to the baseline consideration. And then to your point that they can work in tandem together, when RCA can be stacked on top of that, where the idea would be if somebody is in a situation where they're looking to fund even more than what an IPP can provide, then if they're looking to do more, then they could look at an RCA to sort of provide that supplemental contribution above and beyond that. Now, part of what an actually would do is, in terms of calculating what can go into an RCA, they should recognize the fact that there is an IPP as part of their reasonability calculations. So it'd be to say, all right, there's an IPP in place. So if you're going to try to stack an RCA on top, this is how much additional contribution room that you have. So that would be sort of your baseline consideration. Now, whenever I talk with clients who are sort of looking at both options, there might be situations where that might be flipped. Something I believe we talked about in that episode 17 you referenced was, and there's a key difference between IPPs and RCAs. Both are set up by a corporation or an employee. A key difference is for an IPP, there is a need for the corporation to always be attached to it, for the most part, right? So if a corporation is wound up or dissolved or sold to a third party, typically the IPP is going to have to be wound up and dissolved as well. In which case, you move money to a locked-in RSP. We went into detail in that in episode 17, of course. With an RCA, there's no need to dissolve it. An RCA can actually stand alone, which is part of the reason employers can be so comfortable to do this even for non-owners, right? It can stand by itself. So if somebody is looking to fund something to get money out, but the truth of the matter is they're going to wind up their corporation in a couple years or solid, then an RCA might be the way to go. I mean, it kind of sucks that you can't invest all your money, but if you're looking to tax shelter and defer for a longer period of time, then that might be the way to go in that situation.
Can we shift gears to the investment options inside of an RCA? Because I've run into situations where, because the investment gains are taxable, some advisors are promoting life insurance as a holding inside of an RCA, like permanent life insurance, participating or universal life insurance as a holding inside the RCA to protect some of the taxable capital or taxable gains distributions. I've also heard some pushback on that you'd have to be very, very careful with how you structure permanent life insurance inside of an RCA. There's obviously the traditional options like ETFs, mutual funds, and securities. What are some of the, I guess, warnings you would put out there if someone's considering life insurance options inside of an RCA? And what are some of the most common structures that you see in terms of the investment options when setting it up?
Yeah, sure thing. So I guess a couple comments of that is when it comes to having life insurance within an RCA. It's something obviously that can be done, but the question becomes, does it make sense? And maybe for me um, to briefly kind of summarize all the strategies here for anyone who's listening, it's, I guess the common consideration is, well, you're going to invest money in this RCA investment account. Any realized gains you get, interest dividends, you're going to have to send that into to the CRA. But if you have the RCA owned life insurance policy, then let's say maybe like a universal life policy, for example, maybe you can have those investments held inside the investment portion of the universal life policy, in which case any growth that happens, you don't have to remit that half to the CRA on the growth, which is technically true, but we think there's serious things to consider. One would be, if the RCA is going to be paying an insurance premium to maintain that insurance policy, so suppose the premium is $1,000 a month or what have you. Well, we sort of have to remember the fact that any money that goes into the RCA in the first place is going to have that 50-50 split. So if I want to give the RCA enough money to fund $1,000 premium, I'm actually going to have to give the RCA $2,000 because half the money is going to get a CRA. And then I can use the $1,000 that I have left to then fund the premium. So you sort of have, it's going to cost you more pre-tax dollars, if you will, or corporate dollars to sort of fund the policy. Two will be, what's going to happen, let's say on death, in terms of the death benefit being paid out. If an insurance policy is in a corporation, obviously, there's a death benefit paid to the corporation. It's not taxable. There's the CDA account, there's a credit there. Well, if that death benefit is going to be paid to an RCA, it'll go into the RCA tax free, but once it's in the RCA and it eventually gets paid out, now it's taxable as fully taxable income, right? That there's no capital dividend that can be issued from that. So these are just things to sort of consider and evaluate to see whether or not it makes sense. So we'd say over the years we have seen the strategy just not be taken advantage of as much because of some of the things I mentioned, right? It does make the calculus a little bit more involved. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of strategies out there where maybe permanent insurance is maybe a little oversold to people. So I think there's a lot of rightful sort of consideration for that to say, hey, let's really evaluate this and the details and see if it makes sense. Now, I know we're not trying to do a deep dive into, RCAs are complicated enough, but RCAs and life insurance policies, but there might be some shared ownership arrangements that are done where a corporation owns the death benefit and the RCA owns just the investment portion. So that might be a better way to do it. But that might be beyond maybe what we want to get into in detail today.
Yeah, I've seen some of those arrangements done without an RCA, and it's been a nightmare. Guillaume, I love that you're shaking your head laughing. Insurance is often being told it's
you gotta love
your like tagline.
You gotta love trying to find a suitable place to put a whole life insurance, eh? Like that is like the amount of work and how advisors go at length to find the optimal place to, just squeeze one in, because it makes sense. Oh, you gotta love that.
It's the old cat meme where it's like sitting in a teacup, and if it fits, I'll sit. Like that's yeah.
And then on the surface, it makes sense. And then you start talking about the intricacies of it. And there's about 12 things that like, oh yeah, but there's this and this and that. And at the end of the day, it's like, well, it's so complex, maybe overly complex for like what is the actual true benefit of this entire structure? That's kind of debatable, I guess. But
right. Yeah. And it's, I keep saying, I don't want to take us down the rabbit hole and I say one more thing. But to your point, I'm obviously not knocking down the strategy. There might be cases where it makes sense, but definitely wouldn't apply it carte blanche. One thing I would caution listeners against is I think there was an older strategy of trying to have an insurance policy in an RCA, and there was also some leveraging that would happen, right? Which is, let's put an insurance policy in the RCA. We get to fund the RCA with pre-tax dollars. And then we get to maybe borrow some money against this life insurance policy. It's essentially kind of trying to find a way maybe to loop around and fund insurance policy with corporate pre-tax dollars. I'd say CRA has come on very strongly against that. It's something that they are watching. So that was definitely a strategy that maybe used to work, but it's been highly scrutinized these days.
Would that be the same thing applying to margin on like just investment accounts? So like if someone were to, let's say, deposit 100,000, 50,000 goes into the tax account, and then they were to borrow 25,000 or something like that, securitized by the $50,000 that's actually in the investment account. Does the CRA also scrutinize those types of strategies?
Yeah, so we say those things. Those are things that they're definitely looking into, right? It's because I mean the main point of an RCA is you're putting money into here to fund your retirement is sort of the main strategy. So anything with the sort of leveraging where there's going to be sort of that immediate benefit to either the corporation or the individual, I'd say we'll maybe open the window to them for sure taking a closer look, because it might be using an RCA beyond what it was intended for.
And that's where the vagueness of kind of their definitions can come into play too, right? Like, because if they don't strictly spell out what you can and can't do in there, then they can interpret what you're doing. Is it in the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish, right? And if it's
Right.
not, they can really come down hard on those
Exactly.
strategies.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, given that the ultimate goal of the RCA is to fund, like you mentioned, a retirement, will be part of a retirement plan. You've alluded a little bit already into this discussion, but can you walk us again through whether it's the highly paid executives or the athlete? So, athletes will retire a lot younger usually. So when their contract is up and they're entering retirement, so can you walk us through what is the decumulation? Like, how does that work in terms of decumulating the investment account versus getting a refund back from the refundable taxable account that is held at the CRA? Can you clarify that piece for us, and how the dispersions are taxed at the personal level?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So when it comes time to take money out from the RCA, I suppose one thing I'll say is it does come with a lot of flexibility. Unlike something, let's say like RSPs or locked-in RSPs or whatever, where there's a lot of minimums and maximums and mandatory ages. For example, an RSP you have to start at age 71. That's not the case with with the RCAs. Forgive me. So there's a lot of flexibility to sort of determine amounts and timing of when the income is drawn from the RCA. Now, in terms of how the mechanics would work is once somebody's ready to start taking the income from the RCA, there'd be whatever the number is. I might use $10,000 for just explaining. But the mechanics is that initial withdrawal payment will be paid or decumulated from the investment account. Directly. So it'll be Sam, Guillaume, this year we're going to start paying, and the amount is $10,000. That'll be issued from the investment account. What would happen then is in the January of the following year, that's when the like a special tax or trust T3 return would be filed for the RCA, where we'd report to the CRA saying this amount was withdrawn from the investment account, call it $10,000. So there needs to be a refund issued in terms of half of that. And so CRA would actually literally send a check for that $5,000, half of what was withdrawn, for that to be put back into the into the investment account. So that's sort of how the process would work in terms of somebody starting to take money out of this. Now, I will mention a couple of things. I know you asked about the tax treatment. One is that there obviously would be withholding tax at source. Because any withdrawals at that point, they're just taxed as regular taxable income. So sort of like the same way T4 salary is taxed. So now there'd be your 30% withholding tax at source. And then when the taxes are filed in the following year, it's just as regular taxable income.
That's interesting. So you mentioned a couple times that the account that's being set up is a trust account. Does it follow the same rules as a formal trust in terms of like the 21-year disposition rule and those types of things? I also know that kind of like formal trusts, they're taxed at the highest personal marginal tax rate on investment income. Obviously, it's a little bit different in that aspect because it's a flat 50% of returns that go into the refundable tax. So how does that work?
Yeah, good question. So it would not be subject to the same sort of 21-year disposition rule. And then the way I kind of describe it is, RCAs are sort of treated very specifically in the Income Tax Act with their own set of rules. I mean, if you're going to ask somebody to send you half their money, you better do something special to kind of make it worth to do. So that's part of it, which is why kind of we're able to do things as have named beneficiaries who can continue to take regular amounts from the RCA. So that will be kind of for that, and then to the point as well in terms of how the taxes are calculated. Even for the case of the beneficiaries or whoever's receiving income, it's all taxable in their hands at the regular at whatever tax bracket is applicable to them at that time. And again, because they've really sort of specifically laid out what the rules and barriers are for an RCA in the Act, different from what you might see from another type of trust.
And so even though it's a deferral of some level of compensation from the employer to the employee in many of these cases, withdrawals from the RCAs do not create new RSP contribution room, correct?
That is correct. So for RCAs, two things. One is any money going into the RCA does not affect personal RSP room. And at the same time, the withdrawals do not create new room.
You've already mentioned around the creating, passing on generational wealth, or as a tool to pass on wealth to the next generations. Are there any restrictions as far as who you can put as beneficiaries, on an RCA at the time of your passing, and any like tax implications there, depending on like who you're naming or?
Yeah, great question. So our interpretation practices, no, one thing is it has to be a person, so it's a named beneficiary. The questions sometimes come up, can I name a charity or what have you? Which is, if that was possible, that'd be fantastic. Great how to be able to do that, but it does have to be an individual. But there's no restrictions imposed in terms of, it having to be an immediate family member or what have you. We've actually had cases where, although still a family member, but we've had clients maybe name grandchildren as the beneficiaries, on there. So no restrictions in that regard.
And what are the costs of, like you mentioned, filing a T3 tax return at the end of the year? What are the other costs, maintenance costs that someone who's thinking of setting up an RCAs would need to know and would need to expect?
Mm-hmm. So one would be to set it up is, they're going to need to work with somebody who can actually draft the legal documents. So there's lots of firms out there who can do that. So GBL will be, one of them, of course, where we can. Our setup cost would be $6,000 to draft all the legal documents, the terms and conditions, the trust agreement, and what have you. And then in terms of the annual fee for all the annual filings, for us, you're looking at about $950 a year, which is to do all the required paperwork with the CRA, kind of the compliance and the administration fee. So that will be something to keep in mind, because typically, because these are so niche, most maybe accountants or planners aren't going to have the ability to be able to do that themselves. But we've obviously been able to streamline this because, we get the fun benefit of doing RCAs and IPPs day in, day out. So we kind of have those processes streamlined. So kind of happy to do that service, and hopefully at a reasonable cost.
Okay, so $6,000 upfront and then $1,000 per year. And I believe the IPP mentioned what was the upfront cost again?
So IPP, or at least for the way we do it, is a different model. It's just a flat fee. I believe it was, so base is about $1,700 a year. For
Okay.
an IPP upon member. Yeah.
Okay, so slightly different model for the IPP. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
So I'm a big Leafs fan, Blue Jays fan, Raptors fan, and it seems like all the fans want to bring championships to Canada, but the CRA seems a little bit intent on scrutinizing the highly paid players that come to Canada and to deliver those championships. I'm thinking back to like the Blue Jays era when Bautista, Donaldson, Russell Martin, like those just high level players come to play for the Blue Jays, and then the CRA comes in and says like they're attacking the RCA structures. They're saying you guys are essentially not paying enough tax. Like, what has your experience been on the CRA allowing these structures, especially when like we're talking about players earning $15 to $20 million a year and more in some of these really highly competitive professional programs? Like, why did they go after these individuals? And then like, how can we kind of take that as a bit of a warning on setting up proper structure and those types of things for people in those situations?
Yeah, for sure. Happy to comment on that. So kind of like you mentioned, you've got the three players. It's Bautista, Davidson, and sorry, remind me, what's the catcher's name?
It was Josh Donaldson and Russell Martin. Yeah.
Donaldson and Martin, right?
Yeah.
So for Donaldson and Martin, their case was a little different, and that unfortunately has actually been resolved in their favor. So serious contention there was, obviously there was sort of, I guess you could say their source of income was both on the Canada side and the US side because they're traveling and playing games abroad and whatnot. And they had contributed to an RCA, and serious contention was, well, about 60% of your time was spent in the US, 40% in Canada, and then you put money to the RCA. What you did is you sort of deducted your RCA contributions completely against just the Canadian source income, right? You calculate your 40% of your Canadian source income, and then you fully deduct your RCA against that. So what Syria was trying to come say is, well, you can't do that. What you have to do is you also have to split the RCA contribution 60-40. So rather than fully claim the RCA contributions against your Canadian source income, it's only 40%, a 40% credit that you get. So that was sort of some bickering about what the proper method is. So thankfully, the tax courts came back and said, no, this is a Canadian program, so they should be able to fully credit it against just the Canadian income, which is obviously a maximum benefit to them. So thankful on that, that's been resolved, and that's sort of business as usual. For Jose Batista's case, now that was a little different. I believe it's still before the courts, and there's not too much detailed information on what exactly the issue is. It seems that the contention there is that Mr. Batista had an RCA, but they seem to be deeming that it wasn't effectively an RCA. So, it's are they taking issue with the way it was set up? Are they taking issue with I believe in the first year had a large withdrawal. Are they trying to say that that was unreasonable or what have you? So we're sort of still waiting to hear the details of the arguments and what the results are on that. But what I can speak on, I guess, from GBL's personal experience is we've obviously, at this point, we've set up tens and tens of these for professional athletes, and we haven't had any issues. And I think part of that is you do have to go through a process of setting this up and submitting it to the CRA for them to actually approve the structure of it. So which obviously will help the industry. It's not stuff flying under the radar. This is what we're doing. We're reporting everything. So I think for the most part, it's business as usual, but the industry is watching to see what exactly is going on with Jose Bautista and what the decision is going to be on that.
So with Martin and Donaldson, the fact that the tax courts came back and said, no, you can deduct it fully against your Canadian income, does that now set precedent for other athletes to be able to do the same thing? Is that now saying, okay, across the board, we now know that this is legal, that this is the right way to do it? Or is it still kind of a case-by-case basis and you really have to, watch what you're doing?
Yeah. So, I guess I'll preface this saying I'm not a tax lawyer. But in terms of working with the multiple advisors that people work with, they are proceeding with the understanding that this is now precedence, right? As in, there's been a challenge, there's now case law. This was the decision, so we are going to assume that this is the way that the CRA is going to implement it now.
Good to know.
Yeah. Sorry, one thing you mentioned, I thought it was interesting. You need someone to be residing in Canada because it is a Canadian solution, but can it be sponsored by a US corporation? And it's a highly paid executives and let's say an athlete or a highly paid executives working or competing in Canada, but the corporations is, this in the, in the US, and that's totally fine. As long as who is the RCA set up for is in Canada. Is that correct?
So we would say that it's going to be funded by an employer that's sort of registered to do business in Canada. And as I suppose that will sort of be the part of the point, because really you want to be able to kind of, your tax tier, so you're kind of claiming the tax deductions as well. that would sort of be our understanding of the rules there.
Yeah. Okay. Sam, any other questions for Tatenda?
Well, actually, you know what? I do have one question, and this is kind of going back a few minutes to when we were talking about the tax implications of returns inside an RCA. Just something that popped up, like 50% of the returns are going to that refundable tax on hand account, but are the remaining 50% taxed as specific types of income? So, like for instance, capital gains distributions or dividends, which in Canada, like foreign dividends would have the, greater than 50% withholding tax rate. Canadian dividends would have a 38%, kind of prepaid tax inside a corporation. Are they still taxed? The 50% that remains, that goes back into the corporation, is that taxable as well?
No, that would not be taxable. And I guess to kind of answer your question is, because at this point, once money is in the RCA, it's not a corporate account. Right. So it's all we're sort of dealing with is that, again, the refundable tax that's been remitted to the CRA, but everything else is remaining tax sheltered.
Okay. So it is essentially for the returns you get on the 50% that is not sent to the CRA, that's tax deferred rolling forward, but you do pay that 50%, almost in a sense, withholding tax to the CRA that's refundable when you do take the money out.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's interesting because you don't earn investment income on the 50% that's held with the CRA, but there is a component of like a compounding return that's paid into that withholding tax or that holding tax account going forward on your existing 50% that's invested.
There is, and the only comment I'll make to that is spot on. As you're having sort of those realized gains in the investment account, there's sort of this sending of 50% to the CRA. But the opposite is always true, is if there's a realized loss in the investment account, if we now have a loss, we can actually apply to get that refunded back from the CRA immediately. So it's sort of this fun back and forth balancing that's always happening.
But it's very consistent as far as 50%. Every time there's a dollar that gets into the RCA, 50% of it goes to the refundable account. Whether it's your initial contribution or whether it's a dividend you receive or an interest payment, like everything that flows to that RCA account is 50% across the board. So
yeah,
pretty consistent. It checks out.
Exactly. At least we can understand that, right? No gray areas.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Cool. Tatenda, thank you so much for your time and coming on the podcast for a second time. And let's keep in touch. And for all the listeners, I'll put the link in the show notes if you're interested in learning more where Tatenda works or with GBL, like their services, what they offer. You can visit the websites. And as usual, if you have any questions, you can always reach out and visit mwadvisors.ca. We will also link our social media accounts or on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed this conversation, you want to get in touch with either Sam, myself, or Tatenda, we're all on LinkedIn as well. So feel free to send us an invite and connect there. Thank you for listening and see you in the next episode.